Let's begin this evening's proceedings. Let me welcome you all for this evening session on global governance, the crisis in global governance, reform or reset. This public session we're having today follows 2.5 days of long discussion on a range of global issues, which were organized by the Observer Research Foundation Delhi, the Council on Foreign Relations New York, and through the initiative of Council on Councils. I'm sure Richard is going to say a few words about it, which brings together think tanks from all the major countries in the world. Now, the issue of governance, global governance, used to be a little faddish cult in the international politics, but certainly since the global financial crisis, it has become quite a central theme for us, for all the countries in the world. And for India in particular, which was largely marginal to many of the issues that had emerged in the last 2 decades, today, whether it's climate change, whether it is the way the organization of the global nuclear order, whether it is trade and finance regimes. So you see all the major issues today in the world today are linked in some form to the way the international system is going to collectively respond to those. Through the last 2 centuries, of course, we had this constant tussle between the ideas of a world government, which is often prevailed, and the notion of absolute sovereignty. The tension between these two, that you need a transcendental supranational institutions, while at the same time preserving the sovereignty aspects, that tension, of course, has played out, and we've seen the emergence of a number of functional cooperative institutions over the last 100 years. But today, I think the issues relating to climate change, the issues relating to trade and finance today, demand a far more complex responses, and I think much greater engagement between different nations of the world. But coming to solutions, while everyone agrees that, look, today we need global solutions to our problems, the actually of producing them remains contentious, because the way each nation defines its interests and producing a consensus within each nation has been very difficult. So to discuss some of these issues, I think today I have Richard Haass next to me. Richard Haass is head of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's also been leading this initiative, Council on Councils. Next to him is Rohinton Medhora from Canada. He's from the Global Institute of Innovation, right? I mean, Center for Global Innovation and Institutions. And I'm going to have Sanjay Joshi, the head of the ORF, joining us in a minute. So let me welcome you all for this discussion. And we're also being joined by a large online audience that the CFR is organizing. So to begin with, I think I want to turn to Richard. Richard, you were there when this term, the New World Order, was created in the White House. So you were the President's Special Assistant in 1991, when this whole idea of a New World Order, the end of the Cold War, that we're going to construct a new world. Now, looking back at that moment, I think, was that optimism prevailing over reality, or today, I'm sure we are older and wiser since then. So what do you think about it today?
Well, we're certainly older. Whether we're also wiser, I don't know. Is this not working?
I think it is. No, I think they'll do it.
Okay. The idea of a new world order, it was, as you say, optimistic. It was aspirational. It had 2 origins. One was the cooperation that was at the core of the reaction to Saddam Hussein's invasion and occupation of Kuwait. And it was quite extraordinary. Actually, this summer coming up is the 25th anniversary of that event. And when we look back on it, it's quite remarkable, the degree of international consensus about the idea that territory ought not to be acquired through the use of force. More than a dozen UN Security Council resolutions, and quite an extraordinary coalition put together. So that was one thing that led to this, that could be something of a precedent. And indeed, one of the reasons the administration of the 41st President, George H.W. Bush, did what it did is there was a sense that what was done and how it was done was going to set some precedents and create some momentum for how the post-Cold War world would unfold. So, and secondly, there was, and here's where the optimism kicks in. The Cold War had very little global governance. You had a degree of stability through deterrence. You had arms control negotiations. You had certain implicit understandings between the United States and the Soviet Union about how their competition was to be bounded so it didn't get out of hand. But I wouldn't confuse that with global governance. But you had the post-World War II Bretton Woods institutions. You did have, you had the UN itself. You had some limited things. But the Cold War, in many ways, really limited their effectiveness. And the optimism was that without the automatic lining up of countries along a east-west axis, that it created a possibility that global institutions could finally work without that political overlay. Needless to say, it hasn't quite worked out that way, and I expect we will get to that.
One of the issues, I think it is 1991, the sense of unbounded American power and the American willingness to use that power to reshape international norms and rules, and that was reflected in the kind of intervention that the US was willing to take. But 25 years down the road, I think the two things that have happened. I think one, it's quite clear, after Iraq and Afghanistan, that the US public is not willing to support the kind of interventions, the appetite for interventions has quite clearly come down. So you see that a fundamental constraint, or that's going to force a different way in which the US is going to debate. And partly it also has to do with an argument that you have made, that the US needs to focus on its own, getting its own house in order, rather than trying to fix every problem that it sees around the world.
The answer to both is, to some extent, yes. There is a degree of intervention fatigue in the United States. But even more, there's a degree of intervention disillusionment. The United States spent extraordinary resources, human resources. More than 6,500 Americans gave their lives in Iraq and Afghanistan. More than 40,000 came home with serious injury. You can debate the precise financial cost depending upon the time period you project it over, but it's somewhere between $1 and $3 trillion with the T. And one looks at the disarray in Iraq. One looks at the uncertainty about Afghanistan. And it's hard to stand up here or anyone else and say, we got our money's worth. And our sacrifice was translated into enduring accomplishment. And the answer is it wasn't. So it's not just then fatigue, but it's led to a critical rethinking of what is realistic for the United States to try to accomplish in the world. And this is all, particularly over the last 5-6 years, taken place against the backdrop of the 2008 financial crisis, where the United States had some major challenges, shall we say, in its domestic economy, and still does in some ways, even though we're growing at a fairly healthy rate. A lot of Americans haven't participated in that to the degree that they should and ultimately must. But I don't think it has led to the opposite extreme. The United States has just increased its involvement in Iraq. We continue to keep involvement in Afghanistan. The so-called rebalancing or pivot to Asia is an idea that was formulated over the last few years. The United States, in reaction to what Russia did in Ukraine, is taking some measures to enhance the capacity of NATO. So we can argue whether we've got it exactly right or not, and that's not my point. I'm not saying, indeed, I've been critical of many of the things, how we're doing it. I would simply say that the United States is not isolationist. But I do think there has been something of an adjustment against what I think was the unwisely ambitious undertaking, certainly in Iraq, to some extent in Afghanistan, to remake these societies. And I think we'll get involved in this part of the world. We have to. But it will not be for the purpose of remaking societies.
Rohinton, you focus on the finance and trade-related issues, and your own center has also been dealing with some of the new issues like internet governance, etc. But could you trace us, I mean, help us see the post-2008 evolution at reconstructing some of the global economic institutions, and to see whether they've worked, whether there's going to be even a bigger crisis ahead for us?
Right. So, I mean, as a prelude to that, I'd say two things about the previous conversation, because it's connected to your question.
Sure.
One is that I wouldn't be overly critical or pessimistic about the New World Order not having unfolded the way it should have or would have or was planned, because I can't think of any New World Order that has. I mean, think of the post-World War I world, think even the one that's always held up as the example, post-Bretton Woods. It took a very long time for all of those institutions to kick in, and I'm not sure there was ever an equilibrium that then became disequilibrium. So, you know, give it a break would be my first thought on that. My second would be that let's not, and of course you didn't intend to, let's not equate global governance with matters only, I mean, they're important, but only of war and peace. And so that brings me to your question. Global governance, in addition to the question of how we regulate war and peace, has also arisen as a concept at about the same time that we've come to understand global public goods. And global public goods extend exactly as you said into the areas that go well beyond security. Finance, new technologies like the internet would be too, certainly health would be, anything that spills over. Think of the analogy from national public goods. Go global with that, that's why you need global governance, which then brings me to your question. It takes crisis for change to happen, to state the blindingly obvious, and so one result of the crisis in 2008 was that we finally moved, after kind of thinking about it, and organizations like mine and Richard's and others having nice workshops about it, we moved from that G7, G8 world to the G20 world. And so there was this sense that somehow, because this crisis had emanated in Western Europe and in the US, the time had come for other countries to be represented. We knew that for some time, but there was a sense that the G20 would be the world's economic policeman or body. I think there is some disillusionment about that now. On the other hand, let's look at the positives, start with that. We averted a full-scale trade war. We averted a complete seizure in finance for trade, and those were real possibilities. We averted a total meltdown in the financial system. And the we in this case, in addition to the key players in the US and Europe, was the fact that the G20 was created and everyone realized, especially the emerging powers, that they had an interest in making this happen. So that's one. Has the change since then been fast enough? No. I mean, the crisis has gone away in some ways, become less visible. I really worry about Europe in the next 6 months. I think this could be an issue. But the reasons, for example, that the IMF reform hasn't gone through go well beyond issues of global. It's frankly domestic politics in the US. It's issues to do with Europe. There's a risk then that countries opt out. And so when you see the BRICS Bank, it's one emanation of that. A first best solution clearly would be to reform existing institutions. Creating new ones for their own sake is hardly a good recipe for global governance. I'm not saying, therefore, that if we give it time, everything will be well. The next 6 months, perhaps a year, will be critical. Final thought, there are one or two issues, and I'd name climate change and the internet as two where we simply don't have the institutions. We created institutions at a time where these particular global public goods and their resulting bads did not exist. And on that, we really need to think long and hard about how we organize ourselves.
Yeah.
One of the reasons we don't have the institutions in those areas is we don't have the political consensus. Institutions tend to reflect major power consensus. And question of cyber governance, well, one, there's no consensus, and two, to use your expression, the give it a break thing, it's also wildly new. This is akin, but far more complicated than the intellectual and political challenge posed by nuclear weapons in the 50s. And there's very few people who have the background to deal with technical issues, legal issues, foreign policy issues, to come up with these ideas. So the world is, if you will, playing catch up to the technology. So I think we have to give it a little bit of time, though it's not clear we're catching up. But the other is that I think what's also emerging is that one should not confuse international governance with global governance. And what we're beginning to see is that governance, ANCE, is beginning to come in greater numbers of shapes and sizes. And the least likely and the least common now is the one that most people have in their intellectual screen, which is something that looks like the UN General Assembly. And 192 countries sign up to it. Or maybe it's 193 since we've begun this event. And it's the least likely form of global governance and multilateralism, so whether it's regional in many cases, or what we recently saw, say, between the United States and China on climate change, which is not just bilateral, but in many ways it's less an agreement than a pledge of making certain efforts to bring about certain behaviors. And so all I'm saying is this concept of multilateralism increasingly has to be deconstructed or unpacked. But it's much more varied and much less formal than perhaps the fathers of the idea intended when they first introduced it.
One of the things I wanted to ask both of you, welcome Sanjay. Sanjay has joined us, and Sanjay is the director of Observer Research Foundation. Rohinton, I mean, I think you talked about the post-2008, the international economic, and we talked about the international security side. Now, when there is a tension between the structural change in the power distribution and how that affects the nature of the international institutions, that is, that the nature of the great power relations is not something, these two are not two separate boxes, that what happens among the major powers affects the way international institutions function. For example, on the security side, when Russia was acquiescent in the UN, you had a certain freedom of action. When it is not, you have a different set of issues. Similarly, on the economic side, the emergence of more economic powers outside the traditional Western sphere, that in fact, that is a source of the G20. But have we really succeeded, on, at least on the economic side, to actually make it work, that everyone gets a voice in shaping it, or it ends up being a talk shop?
No, we're clearly not there yet. Even simple things like, simple as in incremental things like IMF quota reform, as I said earlier, is held up. And it isn't as if at the end of that day, somehow China, India, and Brazil would have ended up running the IMF. That's one thought. The other is there are folks who would say that some of these issues are so technocratic that whatever the nature of the board, at the end of the day, resolving a crisis involves A, B, and C. It's not as if there's some competing way of getting it done that China or India, if only you gave them the voice and the votes, would get. So we shouldn't expect too much change in the operations of some of the Bretton Woods institutions if this were to happen. But that said, the fact that it isn't happening, I think, is a real challenge. Whether it means regional alternatives arising, Chiang Mai Initiative in the case of money, plurilateral trade deals in the case of the WTO, the BRICS Bank in the case of the World Bank, these things are happening and they're real. And eventually they end up being inefficient because you have more institutions creating heat and friction when all you could have is a single institution doing the same thing. So we're creating these inefficient second-best solutions, and I'm certainly not for that.
But the shift in great power relations, I think the rise of China as the second largest economy, and the Chinese readiness, I think, to create new institutions. When you talked about the BRICS Bank, now the Chinese have created an Asian Infrastructure Bank. So you see that the shift in the power shift, shall we say, will eventually have some impact on the way the old institutions are run, or whether there's going to be more competition between the older and the newer institutions. And on the security side, when you have Xi Jinping now talks about creating alternative security institutions for Asia. So it's interesting. So for both of you, how you see this.
Well, first of all, I would welcome alternative security systems for Asia. I don't see it as a Chinese idea. Obviously, the devil's in the details. We've got to look at what the principles are that would inform the system. But Asia is systemically thin and weak compared, say, to Europe. You have haven't had the political reconciliation, you haven't had the territorial agreements, and you don't have anything comparable in the way of political, military, diplomatic institutions. And it's much more realistic to ultimately think you could make a contribution to order in Asia regionally than globally. So I don't see necessarily regional institutions as second best. In many cases, I see them as first best. In part also, and that same goes at times for informal arrangements. If Russia wants to veto certain types of action that is worthy on its merits, say what people wanted to do in the former Yugoslavia, or might now want to do about Ukraine, the idea that we should say, well, because we can't get formal consensus within the UN, we're not going to do it, seems to me badly mistaken. So I think we just have to be realistic. The phrase I sometimes use, which I probably shouldn't use with cameras here, is forum shopping. But the idea that you go look for forums where you believe you can get the greatest degree of legitimacy and the greatest degree of effective multilateral participation. And if you can get it at the high formal levels, great. But in most instances, you won't be able to. And you'll have to think regionally or functionally, informally, or increasingly, I think, we'll think more about the coordination of domestic policies. We're seeing it in the economic sphere, but we're seeing it in the climate sphere. We're increasingly regulatory policies where you have certain international standards, but then each country has to put things through its own political system, and they'll come out slightly different. That, to me, is a far more realistic path than trying to get everybody to sign up to a formal piece of international paper, which in most cases, is simply not going to happen.
And if you go by the least common denominator principle, when everybody agrees, it won't be much there of really work.
You spread the butter very thin on the bread at that point.
I'd make the distinction between what I'd call operational institutions, where, frankly, more than if you increase the pool of capital available for infrastructure, this is surely a good thing, and institutions that make rules of the game. And on the latter, I would worry a bit more if we had proliferation of institutions. Case in point, again, resolving sovereign debt. You can't have two institutions with operating on different rules of the game on this. If you have an IMF that is supposed to resolve, and if you then have a regional institution that comes in with different conditionality or weaker conditionality, then this is not a good thing. So on infrastructure too, do they have the same environmental standards? Do they have the same human rights and other standards? So if you have rules of the game, then I'm less worried about proliferation. If you don't, then it does become a bit of an issue.
In some ways, actually, some of the Chinese institutions, have become more attractive in a sense. They don't insist on the kind of things that the Western institutions have done. Yeah. But at the same time, where you insist on human rights and those kind of things are easy to separate themselves out and for them to become more attractive in Africa and in large parts of Asia. But they also need to function like a bank, right? So when it comes to money and how you get the money back, on those, I think one would expect the new institution will be as practical because they're not running a charity. While bilateral aid, you could do it in a strategic terms. Both the trends, of making it more attractive than the old Western institutions, but at the same time also running them like regular money shops.
There'll always be questions of, and if you're talking about economics, there'll be questions of conditionality. If you're talking, and obviously different institutions with different countries driving it would have different priorities when it came to conditionality. In terms of trade, again, there's pretty wide variances in what people believe a trade agreement ought to encompass. Questions of labor standards, environmental standards. There's not even consensus within the United States on this. Mm-hmm. There's big differences between Democrats and Republicans, probably between some Democrats and other Democrats. So it's in principle, again, I'm always in favor of having more involved in the agreement, but in practice, it either makes an agreement impossible in some cases or it dilutes it, as you were getting at. So I think there ought to be sort of the principle of pragmatism here. And just because you get something that is imperfect now, I guess I can continue with bread analogies, half a loaf, it doesn't mean you don't go for 3/4 and more down the road. And I think that's probably a fairly, and some of these bilateral or regional agreements, we're beginning to see it they become laboratories. And principles and things which are established in certain, say, trade agreements, say certain bilateral, say between the United States and the Republic of Korea, are now gaining currency for a regional and conceivably one day a global agreement.
Sanjay, if I might bring you in on climate change and energy-related issues, where you worked extensively on these issues. Now, I think traditionally, our approach to the international system and India's approach has been, look, we do it our way, just get off our backs. But today, given what's happening in the rest of the world, the way it is setting new norms or the new pressures, I think, are we ready, in a sense, is Delhi prepared to make the internal adjustments to deal with the imperatives of climate change? And there, you see, the Americans and the Chinese have gotten together. Some of that language got reflected in the Lima conference. So how do we begin to even address these issues?
Raja, in the context of global governance, I think we perhaps need to relook at the whole problem and some of our academic discourse on global governance. Because many times when we are talking of global governance and multilateral institutions and bilateral institutions, we're still talking of states in a very anthropomorphic sense. We're giving them personas and trying to look at the kinds of negotiations which are going to happen between them and deals which are going to be struck between them. When you look at issues like climate change and many of the trade agreements which you're talking about, drill down to the specifics and the picture gets far more complicated. And this is one of the issues which we are going to confront and which we are confronting time and time again, whether you look at the discussions in Lima, whether you look at them anywhere else. More and more what you are going to see in this kind of situation is that you will see coalitions of interest emerge. We've seen that happening in climate. And these coalitions of interest are very fluid. They move from forum to forum. In one forum, India may align with China, say, on certain particular aspects of climate change. In another, they may diverge with Brazil. On certain trade issues, they may make common cause with someone else. And you are going to see these formats of engagement at several levels. So we need to, when we look at climate change, and when we talk of the whole issue of climate change, there are several things happening in the world today. First of all, the world of energy has suddenly changed again. You're going through a major crisis in the sense of, well, it's a crisis, it's an opportunity, where you are saying energy prices and commodity prices are actually heading down. It's a big downtrend, and there are very fundamental reasons why this downtrend is happening. It is not just affecting the workings of how the climate change negotiations will happen or what will happen to them. It is also going to fundamentally affect a lot of geopolitical and governance issues right in the region where you're involved. I mean, I can elaborate on them later during the questions, but that is my fundamental statement.
But the central problem, both on trade and on climate change, is basically the international system is demanding structural changes in the way we organize our economy. That is, previously even you could try to fend off some of these through, talking about third world, solidarity, UN, those kind of things. But today, these require, I think on climate change and trade, fundamental reorganization of the domestic economy. So the challenge then becomes, look, if you don't reform internally, your capacity to respond external pressures gets a lot more difficult. If you don't, so the balancing, both walking on two legs, as Mao Zedong used to say, that you've got to produce internal change. At the same time, be able to influence the international debate to some extent in your favor. Now, privileging either one of these, of course, is not going to work, but are we intellectually prepared to synergize both the logic of domestic reform and at the same time international activism that kind of works together with the need for change the way we're organized?
See, there are going to be pulls and pressures, and you're seeing those pulls and pressures operating, which are pulling many emerging economies in very divergent directions. On the one hand, you will have very bold action statements. And a lot of this has to do with political messaging. For example, if you look at the agreement, it's not really an agreement, announcement made by China and the US, the world's largest polluters. See, politically, it's a very correct statement. If you start analyzing the impacts of that, of the impacts of the actions which they're going to take, say till 2030, and you add up the figures, the sum does not add up. And if you analyze it further deeply, what you're going to find is that we are negotiating within the broad framework of saying that we are targeting, say, not more than a 2-degree rise in temperature. Then if actually the US-China deal, it is actually a deal between the two largest polluters, gives a lot of room, a lot of allowance, a lot of headway to other emerging economies to grow their emissions at an accelerated rate because it is giving them a headway which they did not have before. So there are two aspects to it. One aspect is that you will probably find emerging economies more willing to come onto the table after this agreement with a more open mind, saying that, okay, if this is the kind of headway we are going to get on our development agenda, we are ready to talk business. But what does it actually mean for the targets which have been set is a different story. Those targets probably will not be met. We probably now need to start thinking more actively and forget the 2-degree limit which we've set and start talking in more pragmatic terms of some other solutions which may include perhaps a greater focus on adaptation, on governance issues related to adaptation, the major issues which are not yet on the table. What happens to migrants? How does the world accommodate climate migrants? Now, these are issues which need to come back on the table and start getting discussed after all this.
We have President Obama is going to be here in barely 2 weeks, and Secretary Kerry, who was here, has talked about energy climate change as one of the major areas in which they're negotiating and try to find some common ground. Given our record and given the domestic difficulties, I mean, you see such a broad understanding. I mean, it need not be exactly like the one the US and China produced, but something different in terms of talking about India doing more sustainable, renewable energies like nuclear, solar. You see an outline of a potential understanding emerging when Obama is here in 2 weeks.
No, I certainly do, because as I said right in the beginning, that this agreement gives a large room to maneuver. And if the basic principles of this agreement are accepted, then the emerging economies probably are in a much more comfortable position. See, for the first time, it is understood, it is accepted that yes, they have a right to grow. They have a right to grow using the best existing technologies. Pricing is going to be an issue. And pricing today has become a major issue. Today, fossil fuels are fighting back with low prices. You have a major crisis. As far as, if you look at what is happening in the world of energy, it is not just the share prices of oil and gas companies which are down. The share prices of wind energy companies, the share prices of solar energy companies, coal companies, they've all gone down and gone down drastically because the world of energy is inherently interconnected. They are forms which substitute each other and substitute each other in the marketplace. You cannot run away from those basic market operations which are going to take place, and you cannot really second guess them.
The US-China agreement as a model is both a good news, bad news agreement. The good news is that there's an agreement, and it ought to be, or at least potentially could be, something of a model for others. The bad news is it doesn't really, in this case, commit China to any specific level of output, just that its output will reach a ceiling, whatever that might turn out to be, in 15 years. So you derive, if you will, tremendous flexibility, which makes agreement less difficult at a certain price, because none of us can now predict exactly what will be the significance of that agreement. So if India wanted to say, given its level of development, it needed, say, 20 years or 25 years before it could make you might be able to get such an agreement. Again, the problem will be that we have no way of knowing of where India would be at the end of that time period and what would be the significance for things climate. That's not necessarily a reason not to do it. And over that period of time, I would hope and expect technologies and the rest would change what it is we're able to do. But we shouldn't kid ourselves. These kinds of agreements are essentially, it reminds me when the United States would sign aid agreements with various countries, and we would pledge best efforts to provide a certain level of aid, our political and constitutional processes taken into consideration. And that's what these are. These are basically best efforts pledges. to put a ceiling on emissions by a date certain without specifying what the ceiling is.
But given the weight that the Obama administration has put on climate change, so you're saying like the US-China deal, I mean, even illusion of movement is good news politically for the administration. And for India, I mean, which has kind of been reluctant to actually produce even small practical agreements, when you see that is a good way for India to go forward, that keep moving the story forward rather than getting a final, all-encompassing solution to the differences with the US.
Well, you can't, because our economies and our societies are such different scale and at such different place. But I would say for India, actually, at the risk of committing heresy here, far more important conceivably at this point than certain climate goals would be certain serious plans for energy modernization. I mean, that's going to affect where India comes out in a decade or 2 decades hence on climate. But right now to choose arbitrary numbers seems to me just that, it's arbitrary given the state of this society and this economy. What really matters is that India makes a concerted effort to follow paths that are not particularly carbon intense. And that raises questions of alternatives to coal, from alternative fuels to gas and nuclear. And that's the debate that I would hope India would have.
I think that's been part of a problem generally in India, that you set multilateral goals as ends in themselves, as a high principle that had to be pursued, while not relating them to the domestic imperatives, where given the transformation of the changes of where energy is produced and how that affects climate, I think that if we focus more on the domestic strategy, that look, this is where I want to be, and then how does that define my external engagement?
See, I would disagree, Raja, because India actually has been far more proactive as far as pro-climate goals are concerned than many other nations. The National Action Plan on Climate Change have actually been very, very aggressive in the goals they've set for themselves, whether it be wind power generation, whether it be solar energy. There are very active programs which, and industry itself, the Indian industry today, see, the biggest advantage which India has is that most of its large power capacities are still to be put up. They do not exist as yet. That growth has still to come. So India is in the very advantageous position, unlike China, which put up some of the most backward and outdated power plants. India today is in a position where the new power plants which are going to come up are going to be on the best and latest technologies, which are anyway going to be the best there is, state of the art. And every Indian power plant which is coming up today, whether it is coal-fired, whether it is gas-fired, uses the best and the latest technology that is available as far as control of emissions is concerned. So that is one advantage which India has.
One reason India will not reach its goals is because of the air conditioning in this room. Go ahead.
I think on the issue is a little more complicated on how you deal with on the trade and economic issues. I mean, I think India has been, has had problems coping with the dramatic transformation of the international trade negotiations now with the TPP, TIPP, and even the Asian economic integration. But where do you see the potential path for India in terms of how does it sustain its domestic economic modernization and bring it more in tune with the imperatives of a global trade and finance regime?
So, I mean, to state the obvious, India's on the outside looking in the TPP, if it ever happens. And I said at the meeting that I am a betting person and I'm not betting it will happen. But if it did happen, then you're on the outside looking in. Therefore, you have 2 options. One is if it happened to wish to buy in at the terms that have been set by others, and there may be good reasons to do that because they may be good terms. And a government can say, we have to do this and put it on someone else in some ways. And governments often like to do that, especially for difficult decisions. The other is to put more oomph in the WTO process. The WTO process isn't dead. It could go sectoral. There are ways to move there. Talking about energy and climate change, a good step would be carbon pricing. There are various carbon pricing schemes. At some point, whether it happens in 5 years, 10 years, or 2, I couldn't tell you, carbon pricing is going to morph into carbon tariffs, and this is going to become a trade flow issue. So India could plan for that. But at this point, the reason you want to modernize your energy sector isn't so that you're conformant to someone's trade agreement, it is because it's good for you.
So you mentioned internet governance, and I think one of the issues there where the problem is a lot more complicated by the presence of large private sector companies.
Yeah.
Like in the US, I mean, it's not just the US government has decided what the position is. I mean, the fight that Obama is having on net neutrality, for example, or the way the big companies have tried to beat the security agencies in the United States by doing more encryption, say Apple, what it is trying to do, that the domestic private interests today on internet actually are a new factor. I think traditionally, we've negotiated is purely as an intergovernmental negotiation.
Yeah. And that's
But in this case, it's going to be a lot more complicated. So
You're 100% right. And the era of, again, it's the UN General Assembly or Security Council model when you have governments and they're the only pieces on the chessboard. Increasingly, that's obsolete, for better and for worse. For worse, it's obviously terrorist groups and things like that. For better, look at the Ebola response. NGOs like Médecins Sans Frontières were instrumental to the effective internet, first to sounding the alarm and then to doing something about it in Africa. So there we'd say non-governmental actors are obviously welcome. In the internet, you're right, companies and individuals are central. And it is going to, it will complicate the negotiating process. The question is, who's at the table? And how do we weight the various interests? The fact that you're doing it amidst such a degree of technological dynamism, if there's, it's one of the reasons that, again, governance lags significantly the challenge. And in some ways, it's growing. And there's what we've seen in the last year or two is that there's the emergence of some serious differences about what ought to be the principles and, above all, what should be the role of governments. And up to now, internet governance, has largely been a bottom-up phenomenon with the principal players not being governments, but in many cases individuals, to some extent companies. Now governments are basically saying, we have major equities here, and we can't allow this to continue anymore. And then it obviously threatens both the unity of the internet, but also the basis upon which information is moved, privacy is maintained, and so forth. So the challenges in this realm seem to me enormous. I mean, if there's anyone in this room who's fairly young and looking for a career path, you would be hard-pressed to choose one that's better than this and to develop the necessary combination of skills to working on it. But this is right now, in some ways, intellectually as well as diplomatically, probably the most challenging governance issue that is out there, and where the least amount of intellectual spade work has been done.
And actually, I don't think this conundrum is limited to new issues. You're not going to get sensible banking regulation if you don't factor in consumers and producers of capital, if you will. I would make the same point about many trade subjects. So the fact that governments are no longer negotiating with each other, much less 192 of them, cuts across the board.
what do you see on the role of the governments and the role of the non-governmental actors? I'm not talking about NGOs, which is a bad word these days, but the private sector.
The situation is the same, whether you're talking of internet governance or you're talking of how the energy and climate debate moves. And just as Rohinton was pointing out, that the stakeholders involved are much larger than the governments. And yes, the private sector has a huge role to play. NGOs have, civil society itself has a huge role to play, and they become very, very active in whether you're talking of internet governance, whether you're talking of the energy conundrum, the climate conundrum. Today, they are very powerful voices and connected in many other ways. And that is where I keep talking about these coalitions of interests, which are being built, so kind of transnationally, supranationally, across various groupings, which keep coming together on various issues, diverging on certain issues, which are pushing, which are pushing certain agendas in certain cases, which are pushing governments, local governments in certain directions. And you're going to see a whole lot more of this. You are going to see governments being pulled in very divergent directions.
So governments are strong. Governments will be a major decisive force, but they also have to deal with a much greater role for the domestic non-governmental organizations, both private sector, the corporate ones, as well as the non-governmental organizations. Much of this has been framed as multi-stakeholderism, but I think it's still an uncharted territory, that the level of comfort, we're nowhere near getting that. But I think we have a very distinguished audience, and I'd like to open this floor for discussion. And please, there will be microphones around, and if we can, we've got about 20 minutes to carry forward this conversation. Pinaki Chakravarti, Ambassador.
I think between isolationism and intervention, there is this middle path that you think that Richard said that the Obama administration was navigating. So I think they have heeded the call of Buddha in terms of following the middle path. But in terms of reform or reset, we've seen G7, G8, G2, and now G20. So would you call this reform or reset? And also the New World Order, whether through this resetting process, are you actually having a New World Order, or is it just, as you said at that time, aspirational? My sense is, and I don't know, I would like to hear your view on this, that a New World Order is probably being created in some way or the other through this process. Perhaps through tinkering or through trial and error, but I think this is going to happen. And I would like to hear your views on that. Thank you very much.
Sure. I would argue it's much more reform than reset. Reset sounds to me like you're starting over and you're building something and putting something new in its place. We're not doing that. We have a large inheritance, much of which in the early years after World War II, but then that's evolved constantly. So it'd be foolish and counterproductive to reset. So what we have is it's really constant reform and tinkering or tweaking, and every once in a while a crisis comes, and then you take a slightly bigger step, like we might have done in the international financial regulatory space. But it seems to me it's a process. Reset is too much a focused event, and I don't think that's how international relations work. Do we see signs of a new world order? Yes, but we also see signs of a new world disorder. There's actually less of a consensus about that force should not be used to acquire territory than there was. Look at what happened in Ukraine. Sovereignty. What was it, about 9 years ago, there seemed to be a consensus within the United Nations about the whole idea that with sovereignty came obligations. And when governments failed to fulfill those obligations, the international community had a responsibility to act. Well, needless to say, we're not seeing that. And if anything, you probably couldn't get such a resolution passed in the United Nations today, because people have seen what it might lead to. So you end up with, rather than a one-directional or one-dimensional answer to your question, you actually have to get selective. And you say, in this area and that, in this part of the world, we see some progress where the balance between what Hedley Bull called forces of order and anarchy, or society and anarchy, is moving in the desirable direction. But obviously in places like the Middle East, they're moving in anything but that. They're moving in the anarchical direction. And in even areas like the internet, they're really, I would say, not quite moving yet, because we don't yet have a direction where there is something of a consensus.
I don't think there's any area where things are falling into place in a way that we can predict.
Mr. Dua?
My question is, at the moment, entire debate, discourse about global governance centers around climate change, trade, and financial institutions. One of the fundamental, prominent, most important threat to emergence of global order is terrorism. The response of the various countries has been ad hoc. Intelligence sharing, meet occasionally, and now latest march into Paris. It shows unity of the world at this. But is there international coordinated search for tackling non-state actors who resort to terrorism and challenge even the present order, leave aside challenge the evolution of global order?
Want me to take a crack?
Yeah.
Look, I think there's elements of it, but I wouldn't exaggerate it on two things. One is there's still not an analytical consensus definitionally. There's also not a policy consensus on what to do, say when a state is unwilling or unable to make sure that terrorists do not set up business within their borders, though there was quite a lot of support for what the United States did in Afghanistan after 9/11. No, I think this is a perfect example where you end up with coalitions of the willing, countries that are like-minded, have capacity, have stakes, and they're willing to share intelligence, act together, what have you, to deal with certain threats that they essentially see in similar terms. And in other cases, most countries simply sit it out. They observe. And every once in a while, you have countries actively working against you. But I think this is an area where to try to set up a formal universal international order would simply not succeed. And my feeling is we don't have the luxury of waiting for that. What we have is the necessity of acting against what you might call a real and present danger, and we ought to put together coalitions of the willing whenever and wherever we can. And there'll obviously also be a tremendous premium placed upon domestic action. A lot of this is are efforts that individual countries and governments are going to have to bear themselves.
Ambassador Fabian, please.
Thank you, Raja, and this is the best way of starting the new year. Congrats to the organizers. Now, I have a question to Richard. I was fascinated by what you said about the intervention fatigue. Well, fatigue is understandable, but I'm sure that that fatigue is combined with some reflection, because you yourself spoke about 65,000 lives and a lot of money and this and that. Of course, we should add not only what America paid, but also what Iraq and others paid. Now, my question to you is that is there a reflection that perhaps the interventions in 1991 and in 2003 could have been avoided? For example, in 1991, was enough effort put in to seek a diplomatic resolution? And as regards 2003, we know that the assumption of WMD, assuming the assumption were correct, perhaps, there was scope for more diplomatic, effort. Now, my second question, if I may be permitted, is to Rohinton, and that is about derivatives. Now, yeah, I have read somewhere that, I may be wrong, that derivatives, the size is about 14 times the GDP of the whole world. Now tell me, does it make any sense? And in this regard, I should like to draw your attention to the distinction made by Aristotle in Nicomachean Ethics between charismatics and economics. Charismatics is when the individual gains and the society doesn't gain. And economics is when both gain. Now, don't you think that derivatives are basically charismatic activities? And if so, how come that the Global Governance Initiative hasn't done much about it, or has something been done and I'm not aware of it? Thank you.
Okay, I'll take mine. Mine's easy to answer quickly. Wars are fought 3 times. They're fought beforehand about whether you should go to war. Then you have the physical conflict, and then you have the battle over the lessons afterwards. So I wouldn't assume after any war there's a consensus. That said, I think the prevailing opinion is that the Gulf War, which was actually 1990-91, to use my phrase, was a war of necessity. And the kind of diplomacy that at that point the Soviets and others were doing would not have succeeded on the sorts of terms that were been set, and the delay that would have been required would have been very damaging for what was left of Kuwait. So I don't see a lot of second guessing on the decision to abandon diplomacy after, 6 months, when sanctions and diplomacy couldn't get Saddam to leave unconditionally and completely from Kuwait. Needless to say, the 2003 Iraq War, far more contentious at every step. And there, again, there isn't a consensus, but I would simply say many more people question the wisdom of both having gone, whether the United States should have gone to war, and then how the war was pursued, in particular, the relationship between what happened during the war proper and the aftermath. So, but that's why historians write books.
On the value of financial innovation and derivatives, I mean, I take your point, but derivatives are not inherently bad. The stock number that you quoted, some of it cancels out. A lot of derivatives actually reduce risk, and the reason you enter into them, the reason firms, so forward hedge, which is a simple form of derivatives, is precisely to reduce risk. So the question about do they always add value, I take the point that there may be some that absolutely don't, but most of them do. Otherwise, people wouldn't really enter into them. The more interesting question, which comes to your point about Aristotle, is even if we thought we don't like them, it's difficult very much. It's a bit like a genie out of a bottle. It's difficult very much to regulate them. Where the regulation comes in is at a different level. So there are now quite sensible proposals, and have been for some time, on managing capital flows, on managing capital accounts. That I can see. There are some sensible proposals on how you tax different kinds of income, particularly income from capital. That I can see. But I wouldn't try and stifle innovation because I don't think one can succeed there.
Mr. Kumar, Ambassador Kumar.
I understand Dr. Henry Kissinger in his book has said that for a stable global order, most of the time there is one country which acts as a hegemon, set the rule, imposes them. In the absence of that hegemon, your concert of countries which set the rule of game. Now, many people feel that for decades, US played the first role. But now do you think with China, whose economy is now half the size of US, with $4 trillion of foreign exchange reserve, and all the things which Professor Rajamohan referred to, in next decade is going to emerge as the next hegemon? If not, which is the concert, and will India part of that concert? Thank you.
I don't see China emerging as a hegemon for many reasons. Simply because China's overall economy is large. China also has this thing called the denominator, which is called, what, 1.2 billion people. And it limits its ability to allocate those resources to a large role. Plus, China has any number of internal challenges, politically, environmentally, demographically. So I think a lot of people, when they look at China, don't see it very accurately, one. I do think that we're in an era of history where hegemony by the US or anybody else is impossible, in part for the reasons we've talked about here. There's too much of a distribution of power to state and non-state actors. There's too many things that are systemic, that again, individual countries, the United States can't dictate the terms of globalization. It's a preposterous notion. So we've got, if you will, a systemic challenge. That said, great powers or major powers have a preponderant role to play. All 192 or 3 members of the General Assembly, shall we say, they may have been created equal, but they are not equal in capacity. And the answer is not the Security Council, because even the Security Council does not accurately reflect the power distribution in today's world. One strong argument for what I just said is the fact that India is not represented. So I think what you end up with, ideally, would be groups of countries, either at the global level or at respective regional levels, that do work hard to develop a degree of commonality of purpose and are willing to do something on behalf of those goals. And you know, when Henry Kissinger and others write about order, you always talk about balances, and then you talk about concepts of legitimacy, that there's some accepted principles about how this aspect of regional or global life are meant to be regulated and organized. And that ought to be the goal of international relations at a global level and at various regional and functional levels. And sure, India, I would say, needs to be a member of it. I think the challenge and question for India, if I may be so bold, is its willingness to do so, and on what terms. That is, to me, the principal national security question facing this country today. For a long time, now I'll get into trouble, India had a foreign policy, national security, which seemed to me to hide behind non-alignment in many cases, to avoid serious amounts of regional and global activism and responsibility. And I would hope that in this era of the world where alignment and non-alignment don't make much sense to me, I would hope that India really takes its rightful place as one of the major shapers of regional and global order.
You see that on the economic side as well, that as India becomes the, say, 8th largest, 9th largest, can it actually play a larger role in shaping the international economic order?
It sure could. India exports economists to the rest of the world.
Which is, I don't know, is a good thing or a bad thing. But,
A mixed blessing.
Sanjay, wanted to say something on the Indian role in the future?
Well, I would agree with Richard, that just as the time for hegemons is gone, the time for non-alignment is also over, and you're a multi-alignment is what the rules of the game are going to be going to the future. India, as it grows, and a lot depends on where the Indian economy moves from here. If a country really has to assert itself on the international stage, it can't do it with sub 5% growth. It first of all has to put its act together, get the leverage to be able to pull its weight. And once that happens, I mean, we saw it happening in the past as well. India's voice grows as its economy grows and its rate of growth improves. And that is what we really should be working towards. The assertion of role on the global arena will come automatically.
So it's again, the internal drives the external. I just take the last two questions, and I think we can carry on this over drinks and dinner. Mr. Pathak at the back.
Mr. Chairman, this connects with the crisis in global governance as much as it does with the prospect of the oldest and the largest democracy in the world being able to work together. There is a concern in India, it should be there, that for far too long the US-led West has been extremely tactical about foreign policy. It was reflected in letting religion be injected into politics. In India, we are very sensitive to this. We suffered division of India and extreme violence in the wake of independence. But seeing that this has been happening at the geopolitical level, one can say the West was happy to see Muslim Brotherhood oppose Nasser, and down the line, it allowed the religious slogan to be the basis for the anti-Soviet campaign. All right, it was successful politically, but at the end of 10 years of what has happened in the last, in the name of war on terror, two things have happened. I think the faith-based militancy has multiplied manifold, and I think it's calling for an answer if democracies of the world have to make any progress. I think if we understand the problem, solution suggests itself that while the gun in the hand while the gun in the hand of the wrong person has to be neutralized, I think all the resources have to be sunk into pushing the countries concerned towards democracy. I think this is the point that is crying for attention in today's day.
Thank you. And I think here, can you give the microphone? Briefly, now we're going to stand between us and dinner.
Thank you. I am Ravinder Singh. I am a technical expert, inventor. So it is not a crisis, it's a tragedy. 5-6 billion people are very poor, and that's the main cause of all the problems. I'm just giving you one example. Indus Water Treaty and Columbia Water Treaty was concluded around 1960. America and Canada, they are having very good, flood management and everything. But we have not implemented, and Indus Water Treaty is the worst in the world. And even after 3 biggest tragedies in Uttarakhand, in Kashmir, in Pakistan, we have not done anything to improve our, water management. And that's the biggest tragedy.
Thank you.
So we are not learning, that's the problem.
I think he's talking about the water issues.
Okay, I got it.
So I think we had one on the Islam, the new religion, politics, democracy, and the water issues. So you want to?
It's hard to combine the answer to those two questions. I don't believe that democracy is the panacea. We can't impose it. Look what the United States tried to do with, shall we say, fairly mixed results in the Middle East over the last decade and a half. Democracy has to largely come from within. Plus, we've learned, and Fareed Zakaria wrote about this, countries in a transition to democracy are not necessarily good citizens. They're very vulnerable to nationalism and populism and other such tendencies. Democracy has to largely come from within, and it needs a basis of civil society and a domestic distribution of power and certain political culture in order to take root. And there's some things we can do to encourage that, but we can't simply make it happen no matter what the scale of our effort. There's many things I think we can and should do, and it would take us 2 more hours to talk about it, and it'll come up at the White House in a couple of weeks to combat violent extremism and so forth. And giving people a stake in their societies is definitely one of them, economically and politically. But in many cases, that is easier said than done. And we've had some very unfortunate experiments with elections in the absence of democracy. And we've seen how that could be a very combustible brew. I would just say about water, and I can't say much because I don't know much. I would say 2 things. One is as if the world needed another issue for potential conflict, we've got one. And I think we have to take it seriously, given population demands and climate change and the rest. And second of all, there's a powerful case that this is an area where new technologies could make an extraordinary difference. Not simply in taking salt desalinization, but also the single biggest emphasis needs to be on avoiding and minimizing wastage. And there's any number of studies that show non-efficient use of water is the single biggest problem facing a lot of societies, and the technology now exists to do something about it. So when countries talk about infrastructure improvement, that ought to be one of the priorities.
I'd say that voice and representation and prosperity, but especially voice and representation, is more important than the mechanics of a certain democratic process. The only other thing I'd say, since we are in 2015, is how the world creates that global compact to follow the MDGs. And it's not necessarily promising as we now know it, will really determine what kind of world we are. It sounds corny to say, but what kind of world we want should be reflected in that kind of compact. The MDGs focused excessively on basic needs and kind of neglected the development as freedom and other aspects of what makes the globe more harmonious. Including sustainability issues. We have time to get that right, and if we all buy into that, then that would be a step in the right direction.
On the water issue, I'd like to comment on that. Actually, there are 2 divergent questions which have been raised, which have 2 completely divergent answers. The first is on the question of the treaty. As far as the treaty itself is concerned, the Indus Treaty is actually a very good example of a treaty which works, and which has worked under the most difficult circumstances between 2 countries which otherwise have totally been at each other's throats for most of the time. The Indus Treaty is a shining example of something which can work under the most adverse situations. But the other part of the question really relates to the issue of the management of water. Now, managing water in a monsoonal climate, such as you have in India, is a very different proposition right across the subcontinent than managing water in other kinds of terrains where the rainfall pattern is far more distributed across the whole pattern of the year. It presents a completely different kind of challenge. But beyond that, you see, this whole concept of this lexicon of managing a river basin always leads us into a completely different dimension. Can a river basin really be managed? Do we have sufficient data, information, when you start going into the technicalities of water management? And a river is a living system. And most of the time when you talk of water management, we are only talking of certain aspects of water management. We're talking of water flows. Whereas there's a whole ecology, there are lives concerned with it, there are livelihoods concerned with it. And generating that kind of data to get into that kind of management of the river basin is actually a Herculean task. We haven't even begun the process to date.
I think on that note, I'm going to bring this discussion to a close. I'm not even going to try and summarize what we've done in the last hour and plus, but I think a couple of things at least stand out quite clearly. I think one, the expanding and intensifying nature of the global capitalism and the linkage between economic development and environment today of forcing choices, I think, on the countries that you can't merely leave it as a mere interstate issue, that you've got to deal with these new challenges that have emerged. I think, second, is the power shift in the international system is going to change the way the international institutions are going to function. And there again, I think the question is, can the changes in the power shift, can the redistribution of power, how do we align it with greater distribution of responsibilities, and how do we bring more people into decision making, and how do we produce the necessary reform or reset for global governance. And the last point about India, I think India's approach, traditional approach to multilateral issues, has been one of bringing the other developing countries together and to bargain with the dominant powers. But I think with India itself becoming one of the largest economies, then the question of how does India take the responsibility? It is not merely about arguing on the basis of first principles of equity and justice, but of how do you produce both efficiency, how do you produce a better system for the international order as a whole. Those challenges, I think, that India today faces, that debate, I think, within India it has only just begun. And there you see some of the recent engagement of the present government. And certainly we're going to see it with when President Obama comes here on the whole question of how India is going to deal with climate change, how India is going to deal with global trade, how India is going to deal with the nuclear issue and climate change. These, I think, are the first signs of a change that is taking place in India, and no longer trapped into the old thing of non-alignment. That I think India as a responsible power, India as a rising power, has fundamentally different set of imperatives on the multilateral domain. And I think we see some of that unfolding in the coming year. So please join me in thanking our three panelists, and thank you all.